The candle on the table shook as Edmund heartily slammed his fist beside it, and the flame bent so low it almost died. Eloan did not move. She stood in the middle of the drawing room with her hands folded in front of her, her chin lifted, while her father's voice cracked through the walls of Hartley House like thunder rolling over a quiet field. "You will marry Baron Fenwick," he said again, for the third time that evening, "or you will leave this house tonight and never come back." Eloan felt her heart pounding, but her voice, when it came, did not shake. "Then I will leave." The room went silent. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to hold its breath. Her mother, Margaret, sat in the corner chair with her hands pressed together in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. She did not speak. She never spoke when Edmund raised his voice like this. Eloan's younger sister, Clara, stood frozen at the bottom of the staircase, one hand gripping the banister so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Edmund stared at his daughter as if he did not recognize her. For 20 years he had watched her grow from a small, laughing child into a woman with a will of iron, and only now, in this moment, did he understand how little control he truly had over her. "You do not understand what you are throwing away," he said, his voice lower now, almost pleading. "Baron Fenwick is a wealthy man. He can save this family. Do you not see what will happen to us if you refuse him? Do you not care?" "I care," Eloan said. "I care enough to refuse a marriage built on nothing but your debts. I will not spend the rest of my life beside a man 3 times my age simply because you owe him money." "He is not asking for charity," Edmund snapped. "He is offering you a home, security, a title. Any other woman in your position would take it gladly." "Then let another woman take it," Eloan said. "I will not." Edmund's face turned the color of ash. He looked for a moment, as though he might argue further, but something in his daughter's eyes told him it would be useless. He had seen that look before, on the rare occasions when Eloan made up her mind about something and refused to bend, no matter what was said to her. It was the same look she had worn as a child when she refused to apologize for a mistake she did not believe she had made. It was the look of someone who would rather lose everything than lose herself. "Then you have made your choice," he said quietly, "and I have made mine. You are no longer welcome under this roof." Margaret gasped softly from her chair, but she still did not rise. Clara took a step forward, her mouth opening as if to protest, but a single glance from her father silenced her before a single word could leave her lips. Eloan felt something cold settle inside her chest, but she did not let it show on her face. She had known, when she refused the Baron for the 3rd time that week, that this moment might come. She had told herself she was prepared for it. Now, standing in the room where she had grown up, watching her father's eyes turn hard and distant, she realized that no one could ever truly prepare for the moment their family cast them out. "Very well," she said, "I will collect my things." She turned and walked up the stairs, past her sister, who reached out a trembling hand but did not quite manage to touch her. In her room, Eloan packed only what she could carry in a single trunk: a few dresses, a shawl that had belonged to her grandmother, a small wooden box containing letters, and a single silver locket, the only thing of value she owned that was truly hers. She worked quickly, her hands steady even though her mind was racing, because she knew that if she allowed herself to slow down, she might begin to cry, and she refused to let her father see her tears. When she came back downstairs, the trunk heavy in her arms, her father was standing by the front door, his expression unreadable. Her mother had not moved from her chair. Clara was nowhere to be seen. Eloan guessed she had fled to her room, unable to watch what was happening. "You still have time to change your mind," Edmund said, though his voice held little hope in it. "I will not," Eloan answered. He opened the door without another word. The night air rushed in, cold and damp, carrying with it the smell of rain that had not yet fallen but was clearly coming. Eloan stepped past her father and out onto the front steps, and behind her, the door closed with a sound that felt final, like the last page of a book being shut. She stood there for a long moment, looking up at the house that had been her home for 22 years. The windows glowed with warm light, but none of that warmth was for her anymore. She thought of Clara's frightened face, of her mother's silence, of her father's cold judgment, and she felt a strange mixture of grief and relief settle over her. Grief, because she had lost her family in a single evening. Relief, because she would never have to become Baroness Fenwick, bound to a man she did not love, for the rest of her life. She lifted her trunk and began to walk. The road away from Hartley House was narrow and lined with old oak trees whose branches stretched over the path like reaching arms. Elowen walked quickly at first, driven by anger and pride, but as the distance grew and the house disappeared behind her, her pace slowed, and the reality of her situation began to settle in. She had no money beyond a few coins sewn into the lining of her cloak. She had no family willing to take her in. Baron Fenwick's influence stretched across the entire county, and she suspected that few of the families who called themselves her friends would risk his displeasure by opening their doors to her. She was right. At the first house she reached, that of a family who had once invited her to tea every week, the maid who answered the door would not even let her step inside. "I am sorry, miss," the girl whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder, "but my mistress says she cannot receive you. Word has already reached her about what happened at Hartley House." Word travels fast in a small county, Elowen thought bitterly, faster than any carriage. At the second house, the door was not even opened. A voice from inside called out that the family was not receiving visitors, though Elowen could see candlelight moving behind the curtains and hear muffled voices that fell silent the moment they recognized her knock. By the time she reached the edge of the village, rain had begun to fall in earnest, soaking through her cloak and chilling her to the bone. She stood beneath the awning of a shuttered shop, her trunk at her feet, and for the first time since she had walked out of her father's house, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had done. She was alone, truly alone in a way she had never been before. No family, no friends willing to help her, no roof over her head for the night. She thought briefly of turning back, of returning to Hartley House and telling her father she would marry Baron Fenwick after all, if only he would let her back inside where it was warm and dry. But the thought lasted only a moment before she pushed it away. She had made her choice for a reason. She would rather sleep in the rain than spend her life married to a man she despised simply because it was easier. She thought of a place then, one she remembered from childhood stories the village children used to whisper about with wide eyes. Beyond the last farm at the edge of the county lay the grounds of Ulcastle, the great estate belonging to the Duke of Ulcastle, a man so feared and so seldom seen that most people in the village had never laid eyes on him. There was an old gamekeeper's cottage near the edge of his land, long abandoned, that the local children dared each other to visit and never did. It would offer at least some shelter from the rain, even if it meant trespassing on land belonging to a man rumored to have a temper as cold and sharp as winter itself. Elowen had little choice. The rain was growing heavier and the night was growing colder, and there was nowhere else left to go. She picked up her trunk once more and turned toward the dark line of trees in the distance, beyond which the grounds of Ulcastle lay hidden in shadow. She did not know, as she walked toward that abandoned cottage with her heart pounding and her clothes soaked through, that she was about to cross into land that would change the entire course of her life. She only knew that she was cold and tired and utterly alone, and that the only shelter left to her belonged to the one man in the county everyone was too afraid to approach. She walked on into the rain, into the dark, toward a fate she could not yet imagine. The trees at the edge of Ulcastle land grew thick and close together, their branches locking overhead like fingers laced in prayer, and the moment Elowen stepped beneath them the rain grew quieter, muffled by the canopy above. She moved carefully along a path she could barely see, guided only by memory of the stories she had heard as a child, stories that always ended with a warning never to cross onto the Duke's land after dark. She told herself those stories were nothing more than tales meant to frighten children into obedience. Every great house had rumors attached to it, and the more isolated the family, the wilder the rumors grew. The Duke of Ulcastle had not been seen in the village for 3 years, not since his wife had died in circumstances no one seemed willing to explain clearly, and in the absence of any real information, the villagers had filled the silence with whatever frightened them most. Some said he had grown cruel with grief. Some said he had locked himself away out of shame. A few of the older women swore he had done something terrible to his wife, though none of them could say exactly what. And Aloan had always suspected that these stories said more about the fear of an unknown, wealthy man living alone than about the man himself. Still, walking through his land in the dark, soaked to the skin, she could not help the small shiver that ran through her each time a branch cracked in the distance or an owl called out somewhere above her. She found the gamekeeper's cottage exactly where she remembered it being, a squat stone building with a sagging roof, half swallowed by ivy that had grown wild and unchecked for years. The door hung crooked on a single hinge, and when she pushed it open, the smell of damp earth and old wood rushed out to meet her. Inside, the cottage was dark and bare, stripped of anything useful long ago, but the roof still held against the rain mostly, and the walls kept out the worst of the wind. It was not warm, and it was not comfortable, but it was shelter, and after the night she had endured, shelter was more than she had dared to hope for an hour earlier. She set her trunk down in the driest corner she could find and sat upon it, wrapping her soaked cloak tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to warm her. Her teeth had begun to chatter, and her fingers had gone stiff and clumsy with cold. She thought about lighting a fire, but she had no dry wood and no way to strike one even if she had. And so she simply sat, listening to the rain drum against what remained of the roof, and let herself think, for the first time all night, about everything she had lost. She thought of her mother's silence, the way Margaret had sat frozen in her chair while her husband cast their daughter out into the storm. Aloan wondered whether her mother had wanted to speak, had wanted to defend her, and simply lacked the courage to do so after so many years of bowing to her husband's temper. She thought of Clara, only 16, watching from the staircase with tears in her eyes, too frightened to say a word. She wondered what would become of her sister now, whether Clara would be the next daughter offered up to settle some debt or secure some advantage. And the thought filled her with a fresh wave of anger that at least kept the worst of the cold at bay for a while. She thought, too, of Baron Fenwick himself, a man she had met perhaps a dozen times, always at gatherings where he watched her with an expression she found deeply unpleasant, as though she were a horse he was considering purchasing. He had never once asked her a single question about herself, never seemed curious about her thoughts or her interests, and yet he had gone to her father and requested her hand as though she were a possession to be acquired rather than a person to be courted. She had refused him the first time gently. She had refused him the second time firmly. By the third time she had stopped bothering to soften her words at all, and it was that refusal, blunt and unmistakable, that had finally driven her father to his breaking point. She did not regret it. Even now, cold and frightened and utterly alone in an abandoned cottage on land that did not belong to her, she did not regret it. She would rather face uncertainty than face a lifetime beside a man who saw her as nothing more than a transaction. The night stretched on, long and miserable. At some point, exhaustion overcame her fear and her discomfort, and she drifted into an uneasy sleep, curled against her trunk with her damp cloak pulled over her like a blanket. She dreamed fitfully of her father's face turning to stone, of doors closing one after another down an endless hallway, of rain that never stopped falling. When she woke, it was still dark, and the rain had not eased, and for a moment she did not know where she was or how she had come to be there. She heard something then. A sound outside the cottage, soft but unmistakable, the crunch of footsteps moving through wet leaves. Her heart leapt into her throat. She sat perfectly still, listening, hoping desperately that it was nothing more than a deer or some other creature passing through the woods. But the footsteps did not sound like an animal's. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, the footsteps of someone walking with purpose. She pressed herself further into the corner of the cottage, wishing she could make herself smaller, wishing the shadows would simply swallow her whole. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a long, terrible moment, there was only silence, broken by the steady patter of rain and the frantic beating of her own heart. Then the door, already hanging crooked on its single hinge, creaked open. A tall figure stood silhouetted in the gray light of early dawn, broad-shouldered and still, framed by the mist rising from the wet ground behind him. Aloan could not see his face clearly in the dim light, but she could feel his eyes on her, sharp and assessing, and she understood, with a cold certainty that settled deep in her stomach, exactly whose land she had trespassed upon. She had heard he was tall. She had heard he was imposing. She had not expected the way his presence seemed to fill the entire doorway, seemed to press the air out of the small room before he had even spoken a single word. "You are trespassing," he said, and his voice was low, measured, without the anger she had braced herself for. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered the way one might remark on the weather. Aloan forced herself to stand, though her legs felt weak beneath her, whether from cold or fear she could not say. "I am aware," she said, and was relieved to hear that her voice, though quiet, did not tremble. "I had nowhere else to go." The figure in the doorway did not move for a long moment. She watched him take in the sight of her, soaked through, shivering, her trunk beside her, her chin lifted despite everything, and something in his expression shifted, though she could not read exactly what it was in the poor light. "You are the Hartley girl," he said finally. It was not a question. Aloan's stomach tightened. Even here, even at the edge of the world, her name had reached before her. "I was," she said. "I no longer have a claim to that name, I think. My father has made that clear enough." Something crossed his face then, something that might almost have been understanding, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He stepped further into the doorway, and for the first time she could see him more clearly. He was younger than the stories had led her to expect, though there was something in his eyes, some deep and quiet weariness, that made him seem far older than his years. His clothes were plain but well made, his dark hair damp from the rain, and though his expression remained guarded, there was nothing cruel in it, nothing that matched the frightening tales the village children whispered about him. "You cannot stay here," he said. "This roof will not hold through another storm, and the walls offer little protection from the cold." Aloan felt a fresh wave of despair rise in her chest. If even this abandoned cottage was to be denied her, she truly did not know where she would go next. "I understand," she said, gathering what remained of her pride. "I will find somewhere else." She bent to lift her trunk, her hands clumsy with cold, and it was only then that she noticed he had not stepped aside to let her pass. He was watching her still, his gaze unreadable, and she felt a fresh flicker of fear beneath her exhaustion. "That is not what I meant," he said quietly. She straightened slowly, uncertain, her trunk still gripped in her stiff fingers. The rain continued to fall outside, softer now, and the gray light of dawn crept further into the small room, illuminating the space between them. "I was told you did not receive guests," she said carefully, testing the words, unsure what to make of the man standing before her. "I do not," he agreed. "I have not in 3 years." She waited, uncertain what he intended, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with fear of the storm outside. Whatever judgment she had expected from him, whatever cruelty the village stories had prepared her for, did not come. Instead, he simply studied her a moment longer, as though weighing something carefully in his mind, some decision that seemed to cost him more than he let show on his face. Then, without another word of explanation, he stepped back from the doorway and extended his hand toward her, his palm open in the pale morning light. "Come with me," he said. For a moment, Aloan simply stared at his outstretched hand, unable to make sense of the offer. Everything she had heard about the Duke of Ulcastle painted him as a man who wanted nothing to do with the world beyond his gates, a man who had shut himself away from society so completely that his own name had become a kind of warning whispered among children. And yet here he stood, in the gray light of a rain-soaked dawn, offering his hand to a stranger who had trespassed on his land. "Why?" she asked, before she could stop herself. A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Because it is raining," he said, "and you will die of cold in this cottage before the week is out, and I find I have little appetite for discovering a body on my land." It was not the kindest reason she had ever heard, but there was an honesty in it that she appreciated more than false comfort would have offered. She hesitated only a moment longer before setting her trunk down and placing her hand in his. His grip was firm, his palm rough with calluses she had not expected from a man of his rank, and he helped her step over the threshold of the cottage without another word. Outside, the rain had softened to a fine mist, and the first pale light of morning was beginning to creep over the tops of the trees, turning the wet leaves silver. "I am Gideon Ashworth," he said, as they began to walk, his long strides slowing to match her weary pace. "Though I imagine the village has given you a rather different name for me." Despite herself, despite the exhaustion and the cold and the fear that still clung to her, Elowen felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. "Several names, in fact," she admitted, "none of them especially flattering." "I would expect nothing less," he said, and though his tone remained even, she thought she detected something almost like amusement beneath it. "What do they call me these days? A monster, a ghost haunting my own halls." "Cruel," she said honestly, because something about the quiet gray morning and the strangeness of the entire situation made honesty feel easier than careful diplomacy. "Cold, a man who locked himself away out of guilt for something terrible." He was silent for a long moment, his jaw tightening slightly, and she wondered if she had offended him, if she had ruined whatever fragile goodwill had led him to offer his hand in the first place. But when he spoke again, his voice was steady, without anger. "There is truth in some of that," he said. "I have locked myself away. I have little patience left for society and its endless judgments, but cruelty was never the reason." He paused, glancing at her sideways, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Guilt, perhaps. That much they have right, even if they do not understand why." Elowen wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what lay behind those careful words, but something in the set of his shoulders told her this was not the moment to push. She had only just met the man, after all, and whatever tragedy had shaped him into the recluse the village feared was not hers to demand answers for. Not yet, not after a single conversation on a rain-soaked path. They walked in silence for a while after that, the estate slowly revealing itself around them as the trees thinned and gave way to open grounds. Ulcastle rose ahead of them through the mist, and Elowen found herself slowing her steps despite her exhaustion, simply to take in the sight of it. She had expected something bleak, something forbidding to match the stories, and there was indeed a certain severity to the gray stone walls and the tall, narrow windows that caught the early light. But there was beauty in it too, an old and dignified beauty, the kind that came from centuries of careful building rather than from any attempt to impress. Ivy climbed one entire wing of the building, and gardens that had clearly once been magnificent stretched out on either side of the long drive, though many of them had grown wild and untended, as though no one had cared for them properly in years. "It was not always like this," Gideon said, noticing the direction of her gaze. "The gardens, I mean, my wife kept them beautifully. Since her passing, I have not had the heart to hire anyone to tend them properly. It felt, for a long time, like erasing something of her." Elowen glanced at him, surprised by the openness of the admission, coming as it did from a man she had been warned was cold and unfeeling. "I am sorry," she said softly, and she meant it. He gave a small, tight nod, accepting the sympathy without dwelling on it, and they continued walking toward the great entrance of the house. As they drew closer, Elowen could see a few figures moving in the windows, servants, she assumed, going about their early morning duties, and she felt a fresh wave of self-consciousness at the state of her appearance. Her dress was soaked and stained with mud from the road. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in damp strands around her face, and she was quite certain she looked nothing like a young woman who ought to be crossing the threshold of a duke's home. "I must look a fright," she murmured half to herself. "You look like someone who walked through a storm because she had nowhere else to go," Gideon said, without turning to look at her. "There is no shame in that." They reached the great doors, and a servant, an older woman with sharp eyes and a composed expression that could not quite hide her surprise, opened them before Gideon had even lifted his hand to knock. She looked from her master to the bedraggled young woman beside him, and though her eyebrows rose fractionally, she said nothing beyond a respectful greeting. "Mrs. Whitfield," Gideon said, "this is Miss Hartley. She will be staying with us for a time. Please see that a room is prepared for her and that she has dry clothes and something warm to eat." Mrs. Whitfield's composure wavered for just a moment, a flicker of astonishment crossing her features before she smoothed it away and offered a polite curtsy. "Of course, Your Grace," she said. "Right this way, miss." As Ullowen stepped past Gideon into the entrance hall of Ulcastle, she cast one last glance back at him, uncertain what she was meant to say, uncertain what any of this meant for her future. He met her gaze steadily, his expression still guarded but no longer as forbidding as it had seemed in the dim light of the cottage doorway. "You will be safe here," he said, as though reading the question in her eyes. "No one will trouble you within these walls." "Thank you," she said, and found that she meant it more deeply than the simple words could express. He gave a small nod, then turned and walked away down a corridor that led deeper into the house, his footsteps echoing against the stone floor, and Ullowen was left to follow Mrs. Whitfield up a wide staircase, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors and tall windows that let in the gray morning light. As they climbed, Ullowen found herself thinking about the man who had just walked away from her, about the strange contradiction he presented. Everything she had heard in the village painted him as cold, distant, even frightening, and yet the man who had found her in that abandoned cottage had shown her nothing but quiet consideration. He had not asked why she had been cast out, had not demanded explanations or justifications, had simply seen a woman in need of shelter, and offered it without hesitation, despite years of avoiding exactly this kind of contact with the outside world. She wondered what had truly happened to his wife, what tragedy had driven a man to shut himself away from society so completely that even the mention of guests seemed to catch his own housekeeper off guard. She wondered, too, why he had chosen to break that isolation for her, a stranger with nothing to offer him, no connections that could benefit him, nothing but a story that likely mirrored, in some small way, whatever loss had shaped his own solitude. Mrs. Whitfield led her to a spacious room on the second floor, its furnishings simple but elegant, a fire already being coaxed to life in the hearth by a young maid who bobbed a quick curtsy before hurrying to fetch dry clothes. The bed, when Ullowen finally sat upon its edge after changing into a borrowed gown, felt impossibly soft after the hard wooden floor of the cottage, and the warmth of the fire began to seep into her chilled bones for the first time in what felt like days, though it had only been a single night. She should have felt relief. She did feel relief in part, but beneath it lay a deeper uncertainty, a question she could not quite shake as she finally allowed herself to lie back against the pillows and close her eyes. She had been cast out by her own family for refusing to become a possession, a transaction, a means to settle a debt. And now she found herself entirely dependent on the mercy of a stranger, a man the entire county feared and misunderstood, whose motives for helping her remained as mysterious as the tragedy that had shaped him. She did not know, as exhaustion finally overtook her and she drifted into a deep and dreamless sleep, that the Duke of Ulcastle stood at that very moment in his study below, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens his late wife had once tended with such care, wondering what had possessed him to break 3 years of careful solitude for a stranger he had found trespassing on his land, and wondering, too, why some part of him did not regret it at all. Ullowen woke to sunlight streaming through tall windows, a sight so unexpected after the storm of the previous night that for a moment she simply lay still, watching dust motes drift through the golden light, uncertain whether she was still dreaming. The room around her was quiet and warm. The fire in the hearth burned down to gentle embers, and someone had left a tray of bread, cheese, and hot tea on the small table beside the bed while she slept. She sat up slowly, testing her limbs, relieved to find that the ache in her bones from the cold night had begun to fade. She ate slowly, savoring the warmth of the tea more than she had savored any meal in recent memory, and tried to make sense of everything that had happened since she had walked out of her father's house less than a full day earlier. It felt, in the quiet safety of this unfamiliar room, almost impossible to believe that only yesterday she had been standing in the drawing room at Hartley House, refusing a marriage that would have secured her family's finances at the cost of her own happiness. A soft knock came at the door, and Mrs. Whitfield entered at Alohan's invitation, carrying a bundle of clothing over one arm. "His Grace instructed me to see that you have proper garments," the housekeeper said, laying the bundle carefully across the foot of the bed. "These belong to a cousin of his who stayed with us some years ago. I believe they will fit you well enough, with some small adjustments." "Thank you," Alohan said, genuinely touched by the gesture, though she could not help the small flush of embarrassment that came with accepting charity from strangers, however kindly offered. "I do not wish to be a burden on the household." Mrs. Whitfield's expression softened, just slightly, the careful professional distance she had maintained the previous evening easing a little in the morning light. "You are no burden, miss. It has been a long time since this house had a guest to look after. I think some of us had nearly forgotten how." There was something in the way she said it, a quiet wistfulness that hinted at years of careful, lonely routine, that made Alohan curious about the household she had stumbled into. "How long have you served the family?" she asked. "Since His Grace was a boy," Mrs. Whitfield said, straightening a fold in the bedcovers that did not need straightening. "I watched him grow up in these halls, watched him marry, watched him." She stopped herself, pressing her lips together, and Alohan understood that she had come close to speaking of something she considered private, something belonging to her master rather than to gossip. "Well, it is not my place to say more. If you wish to know his history, I imagine he will tell you himself in time, should he choose to." Alohan did not press further, though her curiosity had only deepened. Over the following days, as she settled slowly into the rhythms of life at Ulcastle, she found herself piecing together small fragments of the household story from careful observations rather than direct explanations. The portraits in the long gallery included one of a young woman with soft brown eyes and a gentle smile, and though no one spoke her name aloud in Alohan's presence, she understood, from the careful way the servants avoided that particular hallway, that this must have been the late Duchess. The castle itself surprised her more each day. She had expected, based on the village stories, something cold and forbidding, a place that matched the frightening reputation of its master. Instead, she found rooms filled with books, comfortable furniture worn soft with years of use, gardens that, though neglected, still showed traces of the careful design that had once made them beautiful. It was not a house built for cruelty. It was a house built for a family, a house that had simply been left too quiet for too long, its rooms echoing with an absence rather than any darker presence. She saw little of Gideon in those first days. He kept to his study for long hours, and the few times their paths crossed in the hallways or at the edges of the dining room, he offered polite but brief greetings before retreating again into whatever solitary work occupied him. Alohan told herself this suited her well enough. She had no wish to impose upon a man who had already shown her more kindness than she had any right to expect, and she used the quiet days to rest, to think, and slowly, to heal from the wound of her family's rejection. But small kindnesses continued to find their way to her, even in his absence. She discovered, on the third morning, a stack of books left outside her door, novels and histories she had mentioned only in passing to Mrs. Whitfield during a conversation about how she planned to occupy her time. On the fifth day, a fresh bouquet of late autumn flowers appeared on the table in her room, though she never learned who had cut them or from where, since the gardens themselves remained largely wild. When she mentioned, during a meal with Mrs. Whitfield in the small parlor reserved for household matters, that she missed the sound of music, a pianoforte that had stood untouched in the music room for years was tuned and restored within the week, though she never saw who had arranged it. She began to understand that Gideon Ashworth expressed care not through words or presence, but through quiet, careful gestures, small acts that asked nothing in return and demanded no gratitude. It was, she thought, a strange and lonely way to show kindness, and she wondered how long he had lived this way, offering comfort from a careful distance rather than risking the vulnerability of closeness. She met the estate's steward, a practical, plain-spoken man named Mr. Collins, who managed the accounts and the tenant farms with brisk efficiency. He seemed initially wary of her presence, watching her with the careful suspicion of a man who had spent years protecting his employer from unwanted attention. But his manner warmed considerably once he observed that she made no attempt to press for information about the Duke's private affairs, nor did she treat the household staff with anything but genuine respect. "His Grace does not often extend such welcome," Mr. Collins remarked one afternoon as they crossed paths in the entrance hall. "I confess I was surprised when word reached me of a guest staying in the house. Pleasantly surprised, I should add, though I imagine that is not saying a great deal, given how rarely anything surprises me these days in this quiet house." "I am grateful for his kindness," Ullowen said carefully, "though I confess I do not fully understand it." Mr. Collins studied her for a moment, something thoughtful in his expression. "Perhaps," he said, "he simply recognized someone who needed exactly the kind of help he once needed himself and never received." The comment stayed with Ullowen long after Mr. Collins had continued on his way, and she found herself turning it over in her mind during the quiet hours of the following days. What had Gideon Ashworth needed, in whatever dark period of his own life had led to his wife's death and his subsequent retreat from society, that no one had offered him? She began to watch him more closely on the rare occasions their paths crossed, noting the careful control he maintained over his expression, the way his eyes sometimes lingered on the empty spaces of the house as though seeing something or someone that was no longer there. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, she found herself unable to sleep and wandered down to the library in search of something to read, only to discover Gideon already there, seated in a large chair near the fire, a book open on his lap though his gaze was fixed on the flames rather than the pages. He looked up at her entrance, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I did not mean to intrude," Ullowen said, already turning to leave. "You are not intruding," he said, and something in his voice, quieter and less guarded than she had heard from him before, made her pause. "Please, stay if you wish. The library is large enough for us both." She hesitated only a moment before crossing the room and selecting a book from the shelves, settling into a chair a respectful distance from his own. For a long while they sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling softly between them, and Ullowen found herself thinking that this quiet moment, shared with a man the entire county feared and misunderstood, felt more peaceful than any evening she could remember spending within the walls of her father's house. It was the beginning, though she did not yet know it, of something neither of them had expected to find again. After that evening in the library, the quiet distance between them began to soften, slowly, like ice thawing at the edges of a frozen pond. It did not happen all at once. Gideon remained a careful man, unaccustomed to sharing his thoughts freely, and Ullowen respected the walls he had built around himself, understanding instinctively that trust, once broken as badly as his appeared to have been, could not be rushed. But over the following weeks, their paths crossed more often, first by accident and then, gradually, by quiet design. They took to sharing the library most evenings, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply reading in companionable silence, and slowly, in fragments offered a little at a time, Ullowen began to learn the truth behind the rumors that had painted Gideon Ashworth as a cold and frightening recluse. "My marriage was arranged when I was 21, he told her one evening, staring into the fire rather than at her, as though the flames made it easier to speak of things he had kept locked away for years. "My father believed it would strengthen our family's position, and I was young enough and dutiful enough to accept his judgment without much protest. Her name was Isabel. She was kind and gentle, and deserved far better than a husband who married her out of obligation rather than affection." Ullowen listened quietly, sensing that interruption would only close the door he had begun to open. "We grew fond of each other in time," he continued. "Not the great passion the poets write about, perhaps, but a genuine companionship. She loved this house. She loved the gardens especially, spent hours out there even in poor weather, tending flowers that meant nothing to anyone but her." He paused, his jaw tightening. "She caught a fever 3 years ago. Out in the gardens during an early frost she insisted on braving despite my objections. It settled in her lungs. The physicians could do nothing. She was gone within a fortnight." "I am so sorry," Ullowen said softly, and meant it with her whole heart. The village decided, in the absence of any clear explanation, that I must have done something to cause it, Gideon said, a bitter edge creeping into his voice for the first time since she had known him. That I had neglected her, or worse. It was easier for them to imagine some dark scandal than to accept that sometimes tragedy simply happens, without villain or explanation. I stopped correcting them eventually. It seemed a pointless battle against people who had already decided what they wished to believe. That must have been terribly lonely, Alowan said. It was, he admitted. It still is most days, though less so I find since you arrived. The admission hung between them in the quiet room, simple and honest, and Alowan felt something warm bloom in her chest that she was not yet ready to name. She thought of her own family, of the ease with which her father had cast her aside the moment she failed to serve his purposes, and she understood, perhaps for the first time, how deeply isolating it could be to have one's private grief transformed into public gossip, to have the worst assumptions of strangers stand in for the truth simply because the truth was never asked for. "May I tell you something?" she asked, and when he nodded, she found herself speaking more openly than she had intended, describing the years leading up to her refusal of Baron Fenwick, the slow accumulation of small moments that had taught her she meant less to her father than his debts and his pride. She spoke of her mother's silence, a silence she had once mistaken for indifference but now understood, with the clearer eyes that distance provided, was simply its own kind of fear. She spoke of Clara, and her worry for what might become of her younger sister now that Alowan was no longer there to serve as a buffer between her and their father's expectations. "You gave up everything," Gideon said quietly when she finished, "rather than surrender your own judgment to someone else's convenience." "I suppose I did," Alowan said, though it did not feel like a noble choice at the time. It felt like the only choice I could live with. "That is precisely what makes it noble," he said, and something in the steadiness of his gaze when he said it made her look away first, her cheeks warming in a way that had nothing to do with the fire beside them. As autumn deepened into the colder months, their conversations grew easier, more frequent, touching on subjects far beyond their shared history of loss and rejection. Alowan learned that Gideon had a dry, understated sense of humor that emerged only rarely, usually when he least intended it, and that he had a genuine love of history and old maps, spending hours poring over documents that traced the boundaries of his family's land back centuries. He learned, in turn, that Alowan possessed a sharp wit of her own, one she had learned to keep carefully hidden in her father's house, where cleverness in a daughter was considered a liability rather than a virtue. "You hide it well," he told her once, after she had delivered a particularly dry observation about one of his more pompous ancestors, whose portrait hung with obvious self-importance in the long gallery. "That wit of yours, I imagine your father never appreciated it." "He considered it unbecoming," Alowan said, "in a woman who was meant to attract a suitable husband. Baron Fenwick, in particular, did not care for it at all. I believe he once told my father that a clever wife was more trouble than she was worth." "Then Baron Fenwick is a fool," Gideon said, with more heat than she had heard from him on any subject besides his late wife. "And the county is fortunate you refused him, whatever the cost proved to be." She glanced at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice, and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something between admiration and something deeper, something he seemed to catch himself feeling and quickly smoothed away behind his usual careful composure. Slowly, over the passing weeks, Alowan came to understand that the man the village feared bore almost no resemblance to the man she had come to know within the walls of Ulcastle. He was not cold. He was careful, guarded by years of grief and unjust suspicion, but beneath that careful exterior lay a man capable of deep feeling, of quiet generosity, of a loyalty that, once earned, ran deeper than she had ever encountered in another person. She began to look forward to their evenings in the library with an eagerness she tried, not entirely successfully, to hide from herself. For his part, Gideon found himself, for the first time in 3 years, waking each morning with something other than dread. He caught himself smiling at small things, a habit he had nearly forgotten, and found his solitary study feeling emptier on the rare evenings when Aloan retired early, her absence noted with a keenness that unsettled him even as he could not quite bring himself to regret it. Neither of them spoke aloud of what was slowly growing between them. It felt to both too fragile a thing to name too soon, too easily shattered by careless words spoken before either was ready. But it grew nonetheless, in the shared silences of the library, in the small kindnesses that continued to pass quietly between them, in the way their conversations stretched later into the evening with each passing week, neither willing to be the first to suggest they should retire. It was Mrs. Whitfield who first noticed the change, watching from the doorway one evening as her master laughed, genuinely laughed, at something Aloan had said, a sound the housekeeper had not heard echo through the halls of Ulcastle in longer than she cared to remember. She said nothing to either of them, but she began, quietly and without discussion, to see that fresh flowers were placed in the library each morning, and that the fire there was always kept burning a little longer into the evening than strict economy required. Neither Aloan nor Gideon noticed the small conspiracy unfolding around them, too absorbed in the slow, careful rebuilding of two hearts that had each believed, before finding each other, that they had already lost everything worth holding onto. It did not take long for word to travel beyond the gates of Ulcastle. A visiting tradesman, delivering goods to the kitchens, mentioned to a friend in the village that he had glimpsed a young woman walking the grounds beside the Duke himself, laughing at something he had said. The friend mentioned it to his wife. The wife mentioned it at the well the following morning, and within a fortnight the story had grown far beyond its modest beginnings, twisting and expanding with each retelling until it bore only the faintest resemblance to the truth. By the time the story reached the ears of Baron Reginald Fenwick, it had transformed into something scandalous indeed. The disgraced Hartley daughter, so the tale went, had schemed her way into the Duke's household, seducing a grieving widower for his fortune and his title, exactly the sort of ambitious, dishonorable behavior one might expect from a woman who had refused a perfectly respectable marriage out of nothing but vanity and pride. Aloan learned of the rumors first from Mrs. Whitfield, who came to her one afternoon with a troubled expression, clearly uncertain how to broach the subject. "There is talk in the village, miss," the housekeeper said carefully. "Ugly talk, I am afraid, about your presence here. I thought you ought to know, rather than hear it second-hand from someone less kind about the delivery." Aloan felt her stomach tighten with a familiar, weary dread. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the isolation of Ulcastle might have shielded her from the judgment of a county that had already shown her exactly how quickly it turned against anyone who stepped outside the narrow lines it had drawn for respectable behavior. "What are they saying?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the shape of it if not the precise details. Mrs. Whitfield's expression tightened with obvious distaste. "That you schemed your way into his Grace's affections, that you refused Baron Fenwick only because you had set your sights on a grander prize from the start. It is nonsense, miss, every word of it, and anyone who has watched you these past weeks knows it. But nonsense has a way of spreading faster than truth, particularly when it is more entertaining." Aloan sat with the news for a long moment, feeling the old, familiar sting of injustice rise in her chest. She had done nothing to invite such accusations. She had accepted shelter from a man who offered it freely, had grown genuinely fond of his company through nothing more calculated than shared conversation and mutual understanding. And yet the world outside these walls had already decided, without a single fact to support it, that she must be some scheming opportunist. She said nothing of the rumors to Gideon at first, unwilling to burden him with gossip that seemed, in the quiet safety of the library each evening, almost too absurd to take seriously. But the matter was taken entirely out of her hands one gray afternoon in early winter, when the sound of a carriage arriving at the front of the house sent a ripple of unease through the entire household. Aloan was in the small parlor when Mr. Collins appeared in the doorway, his usually composed expression tight with barely controlled irritation. "Baron Fenwick has arrived, miss," he said. "He is demanding to see his Grace, and he is insisting that you be present as well." Aloan's heart sank. but she rose from her chair, straightening her shoulders with the same quiet determination that had carried her through the night she had been cast out of her father's house. Whatever the Baron intended, she would not face it as a frightened girl hiding from consequence. She would face it as the woman who had refused him once already, and had no intention of regretting that choice now. They found Gideon already in the entrance hall, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes hard in a way Aloan had not seen since the morning he found her in the gamekeeper's cottage. Baron Fenwick stood before him, still in his traveling coat, his face flushed with the particular self-righteous anger of a man accustomed to getting his way and deeply unsettled by any obstacle to it. "Your Grace," the Baron said, with a stiff, shallow bow that held little genuine respect, "I have come regarding a matter of some delicacy. Miss Hartley's father has expressed considerable distress at learning his daughter has taken up residence here, unmarried, under your roof. Such an arrangement reflects poorly on her reputation, and by extension on the reputation of this household. I have come to escort her back to her family, where matters may be properly resolved." "Miss Hartley is a guest in my home," Gideon said, his voice cold and level, "and she is free to remain here for as long as she wishes. She is not property to be escorted anywhere against her will, Baron, whatever arrangement you may have once hoped to secure with her father." Fenwick's face reddened further. "Her father retains certain rights over her conduct, Your Grace, whatever her personal wishes may be. It is hardly appropriate for an unmarried woman to reside alone in the household of an unmarried man, whatever the circumstances of her arrival. I am certain you understand the damage such an arrangement does to her prospects, and indeed to yours. I have very little concern remaining for the opinions of a county that decided without evidence that I was responsible for my wife's death," Gideon said, and though his voice remained calm, there was an edge to it now that made even Fenwick take an involuntary step backward. "I have even less concern for the opinion of a man who sought to purchase a wife through her father's debts rather than earn her regard honestly. Miss Hartley will remain here under my protection, for as long as she chooses to stay." Aloan stepped forward then, unable to remain silent while decisions about her own future were debated, as though she had no voice in the matter at all. "I chose to leave my father's house rather than marry you, Baron Fenwick," she said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. "That choice has not changed, and it will not change now, regardless of what rumors you have carried here with you today. I am grateful for the shelter His Grace has offered me, and I owe you no further explanation of my circumstances." Fenwick's eyes narrowed, moving between Aloan and Gideon with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand something neither of them had yet fully admitted, even to themselves. "I see," he said slowly, a cruel edge entering his voice. "It seems the rumors were rather closer to the truth than I first believed. Tell me, Your Grace, does the county know its reclusive duke has taken up with the disgraced daughter of a bankrupt gentry family, or shall I be the one to enlighten them?" "Threaten what you wish," Gideon said, stepping forward until he stood directly between Fenwick and Aloan, his presence suddenly formidable in a way that made the Baron falter despite his earlier bluster. "I have spent 3 years indifferent to the opinions of a county that never once troubled itself to learn the truth before spreading its judgments. I find I remain entirely indifferent still. You will leave my land now, Baron, and you will not return." For a long, tense moment, Fenwick seemed ready to argue further, his mouth opening as though to deliver some final threat. But something in Gideon's expression, the quiet, immovable resolve of a man who had already survived the worst the county's gossip could offer and found himself unbroken by it, seemed to convince the Baron that further argument would gain him nothing. He straightened his coat with an air of wounded dignity, cast one final, cold glance toward Aloan, and turned toward the door. "You will regret this, Your Grace," he said, pausing at the threshold. "Both of you will." "I have regretted a great many things in my life," Gideon replied. "This will not be among them." The door closed behind the Baron with a heavy, final sound, and for a long moment no one in the entrance hall spoke. Aloan felt her heart still pounding, though whether from fear or something closer to gratitude, she could not entirely say. She looked up to find Gideon watching her, His expression softened now that the immediate threat had passed, something protective and fierce still lingering in his eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You did not need to defend me so forcefully." "I did," he said simply. "I find I could not have done otherwise." It was the first time either of them had openly acknowledged, even in such careful, indirect words, the depth of what had grown between them, and though neither spoke further of it in that moment, both understood that something had shifted irrevocably in the space between them. The village might turn against them both. The rumors might spread further still, gathering ugliness with each retelling. But standing in the entrance hall of Ulcastle, watching Gideon Ashworth's quiet fury on her behalf, Elowen understood, with sudden and startling clarity, that she no longer cared what the world beyond these walls believed. She cared only for the truth she had found within them. In the days that followed Baron Fenwick's visit, a heaviness settled over Elowen that she could not entirely shake, despite the warmth and safety Ulcastle continued to offer her. She found herself lying awake at night, turning over the Baron's parting threat in her mind, imagining the shape the rumors might take now that they carried the weight of his particular malice behind them. She thought of Gideon's reputation, already so carefully guarded after 3 years of unjust suspicion, and she began to wonder whether her continued presence in his home might do him more harm than the quiet loneliness he had endured before her arrival. She raised the matter with Mrs. Whitfield first, hoping the older woman might offer some perspective she had not yet considered. "Do you think I ought to leave?" she asked, one evening as the housekeeper helped her set the fire in her room. "I do not wish to bring further scandal upon this household. His Grace has already suffered enough unfair judgment without my presence adding fuel to it." Mrs. Whitfield paused in her work, studying Elowen with an expression that held more understanding than the younger woman had expected. "I have served this family a long time, miss," she said carefully. "I watched His Grace before his marriage, during it, and in the long, quiet years since his wife passed. I have never, in all that time, seen him as he has been these past weeks. Whatever scandal the Baron threatens to stir, I do not believe it weighs as heavily on His Grace's mind as the thought of losing what he has found in you." The words offered little comfort to the doubt gnawing at Elowen's heart, though she recognized the kindness behind them. She had already cost her own family everything, by refusing to bend to their wishes. She could not bear the thought of costing Gideon his peace as well, however fragile and hard one that peace had proven to be. She made her decision 3 days later, on a cold, clear morning when frost had settled over the neglected gardens outside her window, turning them into something almost beautiful in their stillness. She found Gideon in his study, bent over correspondence that had arrived from the county seat, his expression troubled in a way that told her the Baron's threats had already begun bearing their poisonous fruit. "I have been thinking," she said, standing in the doorway until he looked up and gestured for her to enter, "that perhaps I should leave Ulcastle." Gideon's expression shifted immediately, something sharp and pained crossing his features before he could smooth it away. "Has something happened?" he asked. "Has someone treated you unkindly?" "No," she said quickly. "Nothing of the sort. Everyone here has shown me nothing but kindness, far more than I had any right to expect. That is precisely why I have been thinking of leaving. The rumors will only grow worse the longer I remain, and I cannot bear the thought of being the cause of further damage to your reputation, after everything you have already endured unfairly." He set down the letter in his hands, rising slowly from behind his desk, and crossed the room to stand before her, closer than he had ever stood before, close enough that she could see the genuine distress in his eyes. "Is that truly what you wish?" he asked. "To leave?" Elowen hesitated, and in that hesitation lay an answer more honest than any words could have provided. "No," she admitted quietly. "It is not what I wish at all. But I do not know how to weigh my own wishes against the harm my presence might bring to you." "Then let me weigh it for you," Gideon said, and something in his voice, raw and unguarded in a way she had never heard from him before, made her breath catch. "I have spent 3 years alone in this house, alone, believing that the isolation I chose for myself was simply the price of the peace I deserved after everything that happened to Isabel, after everything the village decided to believe about me without ever asking for the truth. I told myself I had made my peace with that solitude. I told myself I no longer needed anything more than these quiet, empty rooms, and the work that filled my days. He paused, and she watched him gather the courage to continue, watched the careful control he had maintained for so long begin, finally, to crack open. Then I found you, half frozen in that abandoned cottage, refusing to beg for help even as you shivered before me, and something in me that I believed had gone entirely numb 3 years ago simply woke up again. I have not felt this alive, alone, not once, not in all the years since Isabel died, until you walked into this house. I do not want you to leave to protect my reputation. My reputation has survived worse than gossip. What I do not know, if I could survive, is watching you walk away. Aloan felt tears gathering in her eyes, unbidden, born of an emotion too large and too sudden to contain gracefully. I refused Baron Fenwick because I would not be given to a man as though I were property to be traded, she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to steady it. I will not accept an offer from you built on obligation either, Gideon. If I stay, I need it to be because I choose to stay, freely, for my own reasons, and not because you have asked me to stay out of pity or convenience. I am not asking out of pity, Gideon said, taking her hands in his grip warm and steady despite the vulnerability so plainly written across his face. I am asking because I have come, over these past weeks, to care for you more deeply than I believed myself capable of caring for anyone again. I am asking you to choose to stay, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you might want to build a life here, with me, freely and entirely of your own will. That is the only kind of choice I would ever want from you. For a long moment, Aloan simply looked at him, at the man the entire county had painted as cold and frightening, at the truth of him standing before her now, honest and open, and utterly unlike the rumors that had followed him for 3 lonely years. She thought of the night she had walked away from her father's house, choosing uncertainty over a life built on obligation and transaction. She thought of everything that uncertain choice had led her to. This quiet house, this careful, wounded man, this feeling blooming in her chest that she recognized now, with sudden clarity, as something she had never expected to find again after everything her family had cost her. Then I choose to stay, she said. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I want to be here, because I want to be with you. The relief and joy that broke across Gideon's face in that moment erased, for good, any last shadow of the cold and distant reputation the village had built around him. He drew her closer, and for the first time since the night they had met in the rain, the careful distance they had both maintained between them dissolved entirely, replaced by something neither of them had dared to hope for again. Outside the study window, the frost on the gardens began to melt beneath the strengthening morning sun, and somewhere in the house, Mrs. Whitfield, passing by the study door and catching a glimpse of the 2 figures standing close together within, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile before continuing quietly on her way, leaving them to their moment undisturbed. News of an understanding between the Duke of Ulcastle and Miss Aloan hardly spread through the county with even greater speed than the earlier rumors had managed, though this time the tone of the whispers shifted gradually, as more truthful accounts began to overtake the exaggerated tales Baron Fenwick had tried to spread in his wounded pride. Those who had actually seen the couple together, tradesmen making deliveries, tenants working the estate's farms, spoke not of scheming or scandal, but of a quiet, evident happiness that seemed to have settled over Ulcastle for the first time in years. Edmund hardly heard the news within days, and his reaction when it came surprised no one who truly understood him. He arrived at Ulcastle's gates one gray afternoon, dressed in his finest coat, his expression carefully arranged into something he clearly hoped would pass for paternal warmth. Aloan received him in the small parlor, with Gideon standing quietly nearby, close enough to offer support but careful not to overshadow whatever conversation she chose to have with the father who had cast her out into a storm only weeks before. "My dear daughter," Edmund began, spreading his hands in a gesture of practiced humility, I have come to say how relieved I am to find you safe and well cared for. I confess I worried terribly after you left that night, though I understand now that everything worked out for the best." Elowen studied her father for a long moment, noting the calculation behind his carefully chosen words, the way his eyes kept drifting toward Gideon, as though measuring the potential advantage this new connection might offer his family's fading fortunes. "You worried so terribly," she said evenly, "that you never once sent word to inquire after my welfare, in all the weeks since you closed your door against me." Edmund's composed expression flickered slightly. "I assumed, given the circumstances, that any attempt at contact might be unwelcome," he said. "I did not wish to intrude upon whatever arrangement you had found for yourself." "You did not know whether I had found any arrangement at all," Elowen said. "You cast me out into a storm with no more concern for my fate than you might have shown discarding an old coat, and you did not think to wonder in all these weeks whether I had survived that night, let alone whether I had found any comfort since." Her father's mouth tightened, some of the practiced warmth draining from his expression, replaced by the old, familiar impatience she remembered so well from their final confrontation. "I came here in good faith, Elowen, to reconcile with my daughter, and to offer my blessing on whatever understanding you have reached with his grace. I had hoped you might show similar grace, rather than dwelling on old grievances." "I am glad to have found happiness," Elowen said, "but I will not pretend that your presence here today has anything to do with reconciliation, Father. You have come because you learned I am to marry a duke, and you hope to salvage some benefit for yourself from a connection you were prepared to abandon entirely only weeks ago." Gideon stepped forward then, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Mr. Hartley," he said, "I intend to marry your daughter because I have come to care for her deeply, and because she has chosen of her own free will to build a life with me. That choice was made without your blessing, and it does not require it now. If you wish to maintain any relationship with your daughter going forward, I would suggest you consider offering an honest apology for the manner in which you treated her, rather than arriving here with expectations of what her happiness might provide for you." Edmund's face reddened, caught between wounded pride and the clear understanding that he held no power in this room, none of the leverage he had once wielded so carelessly over his daughter's future. For a long moment, he seemed prepared to argue further, but something in the steady, unflinching gazes of both Elowen and Gideon convinced him that any further posturing would gain him nothing. "I see," he said stiffly. "Then I suppose I have said what I came to say. I wish you both well." He offered a shallow bow, more formality than genuine sentiment, and took his leave with considerably less dignity than he had arrived with. Elowen felt no triumph in the exchange, only a quiet, settled peace, the sense of a door closing gently on a chapter of her life she no longer needed to carry with her. She thought in the days that followed of her mother and Clara, and wrote to each of them separately, offering warmth and an open invitation to visit Ulcastle whenever they wished, regardless of whatever tension remained with her father. Margaret never responded, though Elowen chose to believe this reflected fear rather than indifference. Clara wrote back within the week, a letter full of relief and quiet joy, expressing hope that she might one day find the same courage her sister had shown in choosing her own path. The wedding itself, when it came in the early spring, was a small and quiet affair, exactly as both Elowen and Gideon had wished. They chose not the grand cathedral in the county seat where society weddings were typically held, but the modest chapel on the Ulcastle grounds, its stone walls softened by the first blooms of the season pushing up through gardens that had, over the preceding months, been slowly and lovingly restored under Elowen's careful direction. She had taken to the gardens with genuine enthusiasm once the weather allowed, working alongside a small team of gardeners to bring life back to the beds Isabel had once tended, though she was careful to preserve certain corners exactly as they had been left, understanding instinctively that some parts of Gideon's past deserved to be honored rather than erased. Mrs. Whitfield stood among the small gathering of guests with unmistakable tears of happiness in her eyes, and Mr. Collins, ever practical, had nonetheless arranged for the finest wine the estate's cellars could offer. insisting that some occasions warranted a small departure from strict economy. Clara had come, despite their father's evident disapproval, and stood beside her sister throughout the ceremony with a proud smile that Elowen would treasure for the rest of her life. As Elowen walked through the chapel doors on Mr. Collins's arm, since she had no father present willing to give her away with any sincerity, she caught sight of Gideon waiting at the altar, and she felt the last remaining traces of doubt and fear that had followed her since that terrible night in the storm finally dissolve entirely. He watched her approach with an expression of such open, undisguised joy that several of the assembled guests, few in number but genuine in their affection, found themselves quietly moved by the sight of a man the county had once feared and misunderstood so completely transformed by love. Their vows were simple, spoken without pretense or grandeur, each promising the other not wealth or status, for neither needed convincing of what already existed between them, but honesty and partnership, and the kind of quiet, steady devotion that asked nothing more than to be chosen, freely and completely, each and every day. When word of the wedding reached the wider county, the tone of the gossip shifted once more, this time settling into something resembling genuine warmth. The story that spread now, embellished with each retelling as such stories always are, told of a young woman who had refused to be traded away by her own family, who had walked through a storm rather than surrender her own judgment, and who had found at the end of that difficult road a man capable of recognizing her worth precisely because he understood, from his own painful experience, exactly what it cost to be misjudged by people who had never troubled themselves to learn the truth. Baron Fenwick, for his part, found himself increasingly excluded from the social circles he had once dominated, his earlier attempts to spread scandal about the couple having backfired badly once the truth of his own petty motivations became more widely understood. He eventually left the county altogether, seeking better fortune elsewhere, and neither Elowen nor Gideon gave him another thought beyond the occasional wry remark about how thoroughly his own bitterness had undone him. As for Elowen, the woman who had once been abandoned on a rain-soaked road for refusing a marriage built on nothing but obligation, she found herself, within the span of a single season, transformed into the Duchess of Ulcastle, a title she wore not as a prize won through scheming or ambition, but as the natural consequence of a choice she had made with her whole heart, on the very night everything else had been taken from her. She had walked away from a life dictated by her father's convenience and found, instead, a life built entirely on her own terms, standing beside a man who had once been as feared and misunderstood as she had once been dismissed and discarded. The village that had turned her away on that cold, rainy night now curtsied respectfully whenever she passed through its streets, and though Elowen never forgot the sting of those closed doors, she carried no lasting bitterness toward the people who had shown it. She understood better than most how easily fear and gossip could shape a person's judgment, and how much courage it took to look past both toward the truth. She had found that courage once on the worst night of her life, and it had led her, against every expectation, toward the very best years still waiting ahead of her. A full year passed before Ulcastle saw its gardens in complete bloom again, and by the time the roses climbed once more along the old stone walls, the house itself had changed in ways that went far deeper than the flowers outside its windows. The long gallery, once a quiet corridor the servants avoided out of respect for old grief, now rang with the occasional sound of laughter as Gideon showed visiting tenants and their children the portraits of his ancestors, inventing playful stories about each stern painted face that made even the youngest guests giggle. The music room, silent for so long, filled most evenings with the sound of Elowen practicing at the restored pianoforte, sometimes accompanied by Gideon's low, imperfect, but earnest singing voice, a sound Mrs. Whitfield claimed she had never once heard from him in all her years of service before Elowen's arrival. Clara visited often that first year, staying for weeks at a time, and it was during one such visit, late in the autumn, that she confided in her sister a truth she had carried quietly for months. Their father had, in the time since Elowen's departure, attempted to arrange a similarly convenient match for Clara herself, hoping to salvage through his younger daughter what he had lost through his elder one's refusal. Clara had watched her sister's story unfold from a distance, had heard the whispered accounts of Aloin's courage in refusing a life built on obligation, and had found in that example the strength to refuse the arrangement herself. "I do not know that I would have found the courage," Clara admitted, sitting beside Aloin in the newly restored garden one crisp afternoon, "if I had not seen what became possible for you. Father was furious. He called me foolish, ungrateful, exactly as he called you. But I kept thinking of you, standing in that drawing room, refusing to bend, and I found I could not do any less myself." Aloin took her sister's hand, feeling a fierce and protective pride swell in her chest. "Where will you go?" she asked. "Has he cast you out as well?" "He threatened to," Clara said, "but Mother, for the first time in longer than I can remember, spoke against him. She said she had already lost one daughter to his stubbornness, and she would not lose another." Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I do not know what changed in her, Aloin, but something did after you left. I think losing you taught her something about the cost of her own silence." The news brought Aloin a complicated mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that her mother had finally found some measure of courage. Sorrow for all the years that same courage had come too late to spare her own painful departure. She invited Clara to remain at Ulcastle for as long as she wished, and Gideon, when consulted, agreed without a moment's hesitation, delighted at the prospect of the quiet house filling further with warmth and laughter. It was not long after Clara's revelation that Aloin discovered she was carrying a child, news that filled the entire household with a joy so profound that even the practical Mr. Collins was seen, on more than one occasion, humming quietly to himself as he went about his duties. Gideon received the news with an emotion so overwhelming that he found himself, for the first time since Aloin had known him, entirely without words, simply holding her close for a long, silent moment before finally managing to whisper his gratitude against her hair. The pregnancy brought its own quiet fears, memories of Isabel's fragile health lingering at the edges of Gideon's mind even as he tried not to let them show. But Aloin proved robust and strong throughout, and when their daughter was finally born on a bright morning in early summer, the entire household gathered in quiet celebration, the sound of a newborn's cry echoing through halls that had known too much silence for far too many years. They named her Isabel, a choice Aloin suggested herself, understanding instinctively that honoring the memory of Gideon's first wife, rather than avoiding it, would bring him a deeper peace than pretending that chapter of his life had never existed. Gideon wept openly when she proposed the name, moved beyond words by the generosity of a gesture few would have thought to offer. And from that day forward, the portrait of the first Duchess that hung in the long gallery was no longer avoided but visited often, the family speaking of her with warmth and gratitude rather than the careful silence of earlier years. The county, once so quick to judge and condemn, gradually came to regard the Duke and Duchess of Ulcastle as something of a local treasure, their story retold at gatherings not as scandal, but as inspiration, proof that courage and honesty could triumph over gossip and convenience. Young women in the county, faced with unwanted arrangements of their own, began quietly invoking Aloin's example, finding in her story the permission they needed to trust their own judgment over the demands of family expectation. Baron Fenwick, from whatever distant county he had settled in, was occasionally mentioned in passing conversation, usually with a note of mild pity rather than any lingering resentment. He had, by all accounts, never managed to secure the advantageous marriage he had once sought so single-mindedly, his reputation having suffered considerably from the manner in which he had conducted himself during his failed attempt to reclaim Aloin for his own purposes. Edmund Hartley's fortunes, meanwhile, continued their slow decline, his debts never fully resolved by the marriage he had once hoped to arrange, though he found himself, in his final years, unexpectedly grateful for a modest but steady allowance that Aloin chose to provide, not out of any obligation, but out of a quiet, hard-won peace with the past that allowed her to extend a measure of grace even to those who had shown her so little of it themselves. It was Gideon who first suggested the arrangement. understanding better than most the particular freedom that came from letting go of old grievances rather than carrying them forward indefinitely. "You do not owe him anything," Gideon told her, when she first raised the idea, uncertain whether he would understand her reasoning. "But I understand why you might choose to offer it regardless. Some choices are made not for the person receiving them, but for the peace of the one making them." Elowen found, in the years that followed, that he was entirely right. The bitterness she had once carried toward her father softened gradually into something closer to distant, careful pity, and she discovered that this softening cost her nothing, while the alternative, carrying that old anger indefinitely, would have cost her a great deal of the peace she had worked so hard to build. Ulcastle itself flourished under the couple's shared care, its gardens restored to a beauty that rivaled even the finest estates in the county, its halls filled with the sound of children's laughter as Isabel grew, followed in time by a younger brother named for Gideon's own father. The house that had once stood as a monument to grief and isolation became instead a place of warmth, known throughout the county not for the frightening rumors that had once surrounded it, but for the genuine kindness of the family who called it home. Elowen never forgot the cold, rain-soaked night that had begun her journey, never forgot the fear and uncertainty of walking away from everything familiar with nothing but a single trunk, and her own stubborn refusal to be traded away like property. But she came to understand with each passing year that this walk through the storm had led her not toward ruin, as her father had so confidently predicted, but toward exactly the life she had not known, until she found it, that she had always deserved. She had refused to be given away, and in that refusal she had found herself given, freely and completely, to a love built on nothing but honest choice, and she never once regretted the storm that had carried her there.